3, 2, 1. Action.
Hi, I'm Sean Cardinale, a writer, producer, and activist, and a proud member of the African American Catholic community of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. I'm honored to have been asked by the board of the African American Performing Arts Center to speak for a bit on Juneteenth, its historical context, and its contemporary importance in light of the suddenly expansive Black Lives Matter movement. The mission statement of the African American Performing Arts Center in Albuquerque reads that APAC is here to preserve, nurture, and support the intellectual and cultural history of African Americans in New Mexico and the Southwest. APAC also lists 3 tenets on its website, which are see history, live through art, and embrace culture. They are wonderful guidelines to live by, for it is through history, art, and culture that we maintain our humanity, that we literally maintain ourselves. And it is through these tenets that our allies may better understand how we've gotten to this current movement. Our history, art, and culture convey our insistence on being treated with love and with the dignity given to us all by God. Juneteenth started as an announcement finally bequeathing full freedom to Black slaves 155 years ago in Galveston, Texas, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted. Juneteenth has since become a tradition, a rightful cause for celebration of Black pride and culture. It's also, however, a painful reminder of how our freedom has been delayed for years. Black Lives Matter started as a moment of outrage by founders Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, sparked by the injustices waged against Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Black people everywhere by the police. It has now become a campaign for justice and dignity, and is a movement with global momentum. Though forged by tragedy, it is auspicious and appropriate that the energy of the Black Lives Matter movement has exploded worldwide on this Juneteenth of 2020. We've seen repeatedly with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and again countless others that freedom and justice is still being denied today. So we must demand recognition that our Black lives do matter, and we must demand we be afforded the same rights, privileges, and dignity afforded everyone else. For the first time in over 60 years, it feels like the world is actually listening and acting on the message of Black Lives Matter. This is our new civil rights movement. This time, right now, is a cauldron of protest and change, and it will foment more art, culture, and historical memory. While we look fondly upon our past Juneteenth celebrations, like the ones Mr. Joe Padrell held in Albuquerque for nearly 15 years, we must also look at the harsh reality of history, which led us to this important human rights moment right now. It's telling that Black freedom delayed is what marks Juneteenth's occasion. The freedom and justice we seek today has been denied for too long, and here's how that history bore out. The Confederacy lost, but Reconstruction failed, and the Compromise of 1877 helped usher in the Jim Crow era of white terrorist campaigns against Blacks, decimating what little enfranchisement had been earned with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. This was slavery by another name. After 40 years of segregation, brave Black men and women served in World War II to return home to a GI Bill that only applied to white veterans. Despite the impressive winnings of the civil rights movement, massive resistance, redlining, and pushback on desegregation efforts plagued us deep into the 1980s and 90s, when police culture became militarized. This is why Dr. Carol Anderson reminds us that America has consistently failed to provide anything approximating equality for its Black citizens. And the gaps between Blacks and whites in wealth, health, housing, employment, and education have turned into chasms. Not accidentally, but as a function of persistent historical efforts to disenfranchise us. Our struggle for equality seems daunting, but we have knowledge of the history that brought us here. We have our fortitude and our inherent dignity, which we're asking our country to acknowledge and support. And now, for the first time since the original Poor People's Campaign, we have international support. Our allies in the current movement must themselves learn the deeds of our forebears. We have to stop being ahistorical as a society. As James Baldwin reminded us, to accept one's past, one's history, is not the same thing as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. And through our culture and our art, we've utilized the energy of our turbulent history. Maya Angelou reminds us that still we rise through the weight of our collective experience and kinship. And it's truly amazing what we've accomplished despite America's ignominious treatment. Our cultural breadth and depth speaks to our strength, perseverance, and hope. We've come together in the richness of our culture as activists and intellectuals, as scientists and athletes and church leaders. Consider how our slave ancestors turned the very Bible used to oppress them into a message of escape and freedom. Think of how Negro spirituals became gospel music, and gospel music influenced the freedom songs of the 1950s and 60s. Think of all we've done despite our subjugation in both antebellum and postbellum time. James Baldwin said, "We all come from men and women who picked cotton and dammed rivers and built railroads and in the teeth of the most terrifying odds. And here we are, once again fomenting an international campaign to defy modern-day overseers and authoritarians." We've been aided along the way by people of amazing renown. Sojourner Truth, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Carter G. Woodson were all deep thinkers who helped articulate the terrible surroundings they lived in. Today, we rely on the incisive minds of Michelle Alexander, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and Cornel West. We're stoked to action as we read Ta-Nehisi Coates and Dr. Carol Anderson. We've been inspired by the gumption, ingenuity, and intelligence of Fannie Lou Hamer, Malcolm X, James Cone, Ellis Hazlitt, and Angela Davis. There are these and so many more who we must study further, and to whom we must show appreciation for paving the way, helping formulate our arguments for freedom today in this Black Lives Matter movement. We must keep learning from our cultural heroes, because they are prophets with wisdom we've hardly tapped. We must learn to persevere as they did and teach and ally with others in this movement now. Again, James Baldwin, a prophet if there ever were one, says that most Americans do not know the destruction, the despair, the trials they're a part of, and they do not want to know. But we must tell them, as our cultural forefathers and mothers did before us. Malcolm X stated that many whites are actually unaware of their own racism until they face some test, and then their racism emerges in one form or another. This is the test. We are going to be pushed back against, perhaps harder than before, but now we can use our collective voice, just like those early Negro spirituals, sending signals of defiance and messages of hope. When we live through our art, we express our culture and our history in song, in dance, in poetry and prose. African Americans have always found a way to express ourselves readily through the arts, the colorful and sonorous extensions of our culture and history. We have sung and danced like our lives depended on it, and too often our lives did depend on it. It's the same with our protests and expressions now. Living through our art means getting in touch with our spirit, which will help keep this movement alive. We will not keep this momentum with just our minds and hearts, but also our spirit, our souls. Look at the images of us Augusta Savage captured with her sculpture. Peer into the depths of the eyes of the portraits by Henry Osawa Tanner. Read from the richness of Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, and also the singers of the Harlem Renaissance like Florence Mills and Paul Robeson. For Robeson, there was no difference in the end between his art and his politics. He believed that artists are the gatekeepers of truth, that they are civilization's radical voice, and that the artist must take sides. He must elect to fight for freedom or slavery. Artists can be prolific, like High Priestess of Soul, Nina Simone, singing truth to power when she said, "An artist's duty is to reflect the times." Our young Black artists can contribute to these protests with their art. I wonder what this movement will stir in today's painters and singers and filmmakers. Gospel uplifted, the blues spoke to the horrors of the American nadir. Then came the blast of jazz, rock and roll, R&B, and hip-hop. The soul music of my youth in the early 70s became inseparable from the headlines of the day. Marvin Gaye, the Isley Brothers, and Stevie Wonder all encouraged us to reach for higher ground. Maybe our young artists today will hear all this commotion and protest and prayer and respond as our forebears did. I hope so. I've covered but a slice of our history, a hint of our artistry, the briefest overview of our culture. But this note, sent to you with all my heart, is a wish for peace, an intention of progress, and an insistence on justice. And it's just the start. Black lives do matter, and it demands repeating until this country bears that truth out, in its culture, in its laws, its behavior. America must take the truism that Black Lives Matter into its soul and transform the promise of its most cherished documents and decrees from the potential of what could be to the realization of what is. That realization will then manifest into our true freedom, not delayed or denied. I encourage young playwrights, actors and musicians, poets and novelists, singers, rappers and dancers, athletes and academics to seek the expression within you that pushes society's envelope and voices our very real concerns. Each of you can express the multifaceted experiences shared by Black people and can speak to this amazing, fiery, demanding new human rights movement called Black Lives Matter. Black people, let's build each other up and embrace all of us, because there can be no stigmatizing, no sexism, homophobia, transphobia, or colorism. We must reject that nonsense. We must also welcome earnest, effective allies, not just corporate performative measures. Since George Floyd died, I've had tens of people ask me, what can I do? What do you need? And it's touched my heart every time. When they ask, how can I help? I say, protest. And if they can't do that, I say, pay up. Give to the myriad organizations who have our Black well-being in mind. And if they can't do that, I say, proselytize. Do something. Recruit someone else to the cause of Black lives and human rights. Disabuse your family members and friends of the error of their narrowed thinking. Remind them that we came to this moment, this movement, after a long, harrowing battle for our right to live free. Read, write, react, but do something. Protest, pay up, or proselytize. We have been expressing in one form or another that our Black lives matter from the very founding of America. That message, that truth, has always been there in our art, our history, and our culture. Thank you for your time today. Please enjoy a safe, healthy, exuberant, and prideful Juneteenth.